Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Kalispera σας. Don't let the background fool you. We all live in a parallel universe sometimes. Let me start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. We pay our respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to tonight's online seminar brought to you by the Greek community of Melbourne, which will be delivered by Dr. Yannis Spyropoulos and is entitled The Janissaries of Crete, 1669 to 1826. Allow me to go through some housekeeping items before we venture into tonight's seminar. Firstly, we'd like to thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Maria Irakis, a Cretan herself, and invite you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. With respect to next week's seminar, that will also be online, but will be delivered in Greek. We do aim over the course of the year to have 3 or 4 seminars delivered in the Greek language. It's on Karamanlidica literature, and if you recall, the Karamanlidis were the Turkish-speaking Greek Orthodox Christians of Anatolia who wrote the Turkish language in Greek script. It should be an interesting presentation. And just a reminder for those that will have any questions during our Q&A session, simply submit them to the chat or comment section on Facebook or YouTube. We will pick them up from there and then convey them to our speaker tonight. Let's get to our topic. The term Janissaries often stirs up many emotions. During Ottoman raids, small boys were especially coveted plunder. Ottoman Turkish warriors kidnapped young Christian boys and gave them as a gift to the Sultan. They owed their allegiance to the Sultan. They were converted to Islam and their life was dedicated to constant military drilling and exercise. Their sole purpose was to serve the Sultan and defend the Ottoman Empire. Later on, the Janissaries, aware of their power, forced the Sultan to give them more privileges. They were allowed to marry, they were allowed to conduct business. Their ranks became hereditary, but this was also the beginning of their demise. Strongly holding to their rights and controlling sultans, they resisted any reform. By indulging in ordinary life and Crete in Ottoman times was always frontier territory, and there were Janissary calls in its major cities. What you also had with time is the localization of some Janissary units, with local Cretans joining their ranks. To examine all this, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Yannis Spyropoulos. Dr. Spyropoulos' undergraduate studies were in history at the University of Komotini in Thrace, and also Turkology at Erasmus Institute of Mediterranean Studies. The Janissaries of Crete was part of his PhD dissertation. His research interests mainly concern early modern Mediterranean, and his publications deal with subjects such as large landed estates in the Balkans, the institution of slavery, water management, the African diaspora of the Ottoman Empire, the history of Ottoman Crete, as we see tonight, and economic, social, and political history of Ottoman military institutions. Enough for me. Pass on to our speaker tonight, Dr. Yannis Spyropoulos. Yanni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nico. Before I start, I would like to thank the Greek Orthodox community of Melbourne, and especially Nick, for inviting me to this great seminar series, as I see a number of very important Greek historians participate. Also, I would like to note that research for this paper is being funded by the European Research Council in the framework of the ERC project called JANET, that is Janissary Networks, Janissaries in Ottoman port cities, Muslim financial and political networks in the early modern Mediterranean. The Janissaries constitute one of the most intriguing, hotly debated, and yet least understood institutions of the Ottoman Empire. They were created in the 14th century as an elite military force which acted as the Sultan's private guard. Their manpower originally comprised slaves that were either war captives or youths enrolled through the devshirme, pedomazoma as we call it in Greek, a levy of young Christian boys who were forcibly taken from their families in the Balkans and Anatolia and converted to Islam. These children were given out to Turkish families in villages as manual laborers for a number of years in order to learn the Turkish language and be instructed to the basic principles of Islam. After this period ended, they were returned to Istanbul, where they completed their training and served in various imperial institutions, through which they often managed to occupy some of the empire's most important military and administrative posts. In theory, this system ensured the suitability of the people who participated in the Ottoman governance and army and guaranteed the quality of their training and their obedience to the Sultan while preventing the emergence of a self-reproducing elite. That is owing to the fact that the existence of the devshirme pedomazoma largely blocked the hereditary transfer of offices within the higher echelons of the administration. However, as Nikos also said, in the first half of the 16th century, the sons of Janissaries gained the right to enter the corps, while by the end of the same century, a great number of outsiders also started being enrolled as Janissaries. This development, which reflected the political trends and military necessities of the time, had as a result the gradual demise and eventual cessation of the devshirme and its replacement by a much more open system of appointments, which allowed a great number of Muslim-born subjects to enter the corps. This meant that starting from the second half of the 16th century, thousands of Muslims who had the financial and political means to infiltrate the Janissary ranks managed to become soldiers. This infiltration, in turn, provided them with a steady salary, the opportunity to move higher in the administrative and military hierarchy of the Ottoman state, and a number of other privileges that we will deal with later on. Now, following these developments, the number of officially registered Janissaries rose from approximately 2,000 men in the late 14th to more than 50,000 in the second half of the 17th and more than 100,000 in the early 19th century. During this expansion, the Janissaries also started to gradually acquire a more decentralized identity. In the second half of the 15th century, they were mostly based in the Ottoman capital. But from the 16th century onward, rotating Janissary garrisons began to be appointed in growing numbers in provincial fortresses. With the exception of the Ottoman state's semi-autonomous North African regencies of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, where the appointed Janissary forces gained permanence and created their own autonomous administration during the 16th century, in the rest of the empire, Janissary regiments continued to rotate from one provincial garrison to another every few years until the early 18th century. At that time, as we will discuss later, each Janissary regiment started acquiring permanent presence in particular provincial fortresses and creating stronger connections with the local societies. From the above, it becomes clear that by the beginning of the period I'm dealing with in this presentation, that is at around the second half of the 17th century, first, the devshirme pedomazoma had become largely obsolete, and second, the Janissaries had ceased to be the elite military corps that they once had been, and consisted mainly of Muslim-born Ottoman subjects coming from a wide spectrum of social classes. Now, let me note at this point that a number of problems concerning the perception of the Janissary corps are to be found in the historiography of the Ottoman Empire. To date, Ottomanist scholars have placed excessive emphasis on the military performance of Janissaries and their political presence in Istanbul, to the detriment of the study of the institution's multifunctional dimension and its activity in the provinces. Also, the Janissaries' involvement in the economic life of the empire is usually treated by the literature as a departure from their real destination, that is the conduct of war. While their history on the state's periphery remains generally unknown. Recent studies, however, reveal that the Janissary corps was a decentralized body with multiple remits, functions, and inherent institutional characteristics that allowed and enforced its active participation in the economic life of the Ottoman state. In fact, in the early modern period, this participation was to become one of the most important means for the involvement of Ottoman Muslims in the empire's increasingly monetized economy, and in turn, for the expansion of Muslim popular participation in Ottoman institutions and the latter's adaptation to the rapid global political and economic developments of the time. By dealing with these questions in the framework of this presentation, I will try to explain how this popularization of the Janissary core took place in the case of Ottoman Crete and which were its most important economic and political effects. But first, let's take a look at when and how the Janissaries were established on the island. Even at the earliest phase of the War for Crete, which started in 1645 and lasted until 1669, the Ottomans started an extended campaign for the recruitment of soldiers of Cretan origin into their military forces. In this spirit, they created 13 different types of local corps that were installed in all of the island's fortresses, drawing their manpower mainly from local converts. It was during that time that the first en masse conversions of Cretans started taking place, and soon a large local Muslim community was created as a result. The Janissaries, the main driving force behind the conquest of Crete, excuse me, enjoyed an elevated status compared to the soldiers of these local corps. But during that first phase, the island's population was still quite reluctant to join their forces, mainly because of their regiment's periodic rotation to different fortresses all around the empire, which meant that most people who would be enrolled as Janissaries would eventually have to be uprooted from their place of origin and appointed to a different Ottoman province every 3 years or so. At that time, the Janissaries that invaded Crete were still a quite efficient army, consisting mainly of professional soldiers that received good salaries and bonuses and traveled all around the empire in order to fight. This constant military migration, of course, meant that it was very difficult for them as well to get involved into the island's financial and political life. But this was about to change. After the conquest of the last Venetian strongholds in the area and the signing of the Ottoman-Venetian peace treaty of Passarovich in 1718, Istanbul decided to gradually withdraw most of its imperial troops from Crete, leaving only a limited but not insignificant number of Janissaries in the island's three cities. Also, in the 1730s, the Ottoman central administration started, for financial reasons, to reduce and eventually stopped the regular periodic rotations of Janissary regiments around the empire's provinces. The result was that by the end of the 1750s, 11 specific Janissary regiments had their presence on the island consolidated, in fact, that set in motion a process of rapid localization of their manpower and financial resources. This process was bidirectional. On the one hand, the non-Cretan Janissaries realized that since they were appointed on the island for life, their interests rested mainly with their contact with the Cretan society. And on the other, the Cretans started perceiving the Janissary institution as a safer investment that wouldn't eventually drive them out of their homeland, away from their families and local businesses. The regiment's opening towards the local society proved to be a huge success, and a new wave of conversion started taking place. It is around the 1770s that all contemporary sources start claiming that almost every Muslim in Crete had become a Janissary, and estimating the numbers of the local Muslim community to an all-time high, reaching approximately half of the island's population. Thanks to this expansion, the Janissary regiment's common funds also started growing rapidly, investing in real estate and interest loans, and eventually, by the end of the century, dominating the island's credit system. Within the next decades, the Janissaries and their networks managed to control the guilds of the three cities of Crete, that is Iraklio or Kandije, as it was called back then, Hania, Hania, today's Hania, and Resmo, today's Rethymno. They also managed to control most of the island's tax farms, its olive oil and soap production, and the largest part of its maritime trade. But how can we explain this rapid economic development and popularization of the Cretan Janissary networks in economic and institutional terms? Such connections can be better understood in relation with the privileges that the membership of the court offered. One such benefit, for instance, were tax exemptions, a privilege reserved for all members of the empire's administrative and military class. Furthermore, the court's regulations stipulated that janissaries were granted ex officio status of jurisdictional autonomy. It should be noted that this privilege was of particular importance as it ensured a number of benefits for all social and professional categories that entered the core. In the case of rich tax farmers, for instance, it created the conditions for greater liberty in the administration of the areas which they controlled and for greater profit, as it blocked any regulatory intervention on the part of Ottoman officials. In a similar fashion, it offered multiple benefits to people who had small or medium-sized properties, participated in the guilds, or conducted commerce. The immunity of janissaries from regular procedures of prosecution applied to everyone else, which secured them a trial by their elders and peers as opposed to a court of law, proved to be an invaluable advantage in business. If one were protected by the immunity of membership in the core, then judicial authorities or market inspectors could not interfere with one's business. Thus, a merchant who became a janissary could engage in a broader variety of business practices than could a regular merchant, such as breaking the price ceilings in their dealings with others, and so on. Now, besides tax exemptions and judicial immunity, the Janissary Corps was also providing its members a number of other privileges. Access to credit issued by the regiment's common funds, for example, acted as an enticement for the enrollment of many small or wealthy entrepreneurs in the Corps, since in a period of increasing monetization of the Ottoman economy, ready access to cash was becoming a particularly important asset for every business. Furthermore, the central role that janissaries played in the provinces as members of administrative councils and police forces in urban centers, where a major part of the empire's artisanal and commercial activity was taking place, helped them establish their networks and assert control over regional markets. At the same time, interregimental connections and the secondment of troops and regiment units from one provincial fortress to another offered opportunities for the development of transprovincial networks and long-distance trade to the Corps' members. In a nutshell, the janissaries offered their affiliates a wide range of privileges, which made enrollment in the Corps very attractive for the Muslims of Crete and the Ottoman provinces in general. But how could this increase in staff be justified in institutional terms? After all, the regiment could not recruit an unlimited number of soldiers into its ranks, as it was up to the central administration to determine the budget allocated to the Corps and the number of pay certificates available for every provincial garrison. In practice, though, since most people were mainly interested in the privileges and protection offered by the Corps and not in its salaries, this inconvenience was dealt with locally via an illegal practice that had been around for some time, but not in Crete. Soon after the stabilization of the presence on the island, the janissary officers realized that the central administration had no means whatsoever of overseeing who actually entered their units. This is when they started decentralizing the process of manning their regiments through the acceptance in them of thousands of janissary pretenders who received no salary but enjoyed the same privileges as any officially recruited janissary under the auspices of their patron officers, who were in charge of keeping the personnel registers of each regiment. Since the Janissaries enjoyed jurisdictional autonomy from local authorities and were not dependent on provincial officials for their payments, no governor or judge had access to these registers. Consequently, their networks could stretch far beyond their regiment's circle without outsiders being able to discern who was a real member of their organization and who was not. It is then owing to this practice that the sources testify to the elusive enrollment of the entire male population of given areas in the Janissary Corps. Such mentions are to be found not only in the case of Crete, but also in Bulgaria, Thessaloniki, Erzurum, and tens of other places around the empire. The phenomenon, in fact, seems to have been so widespread at the imperial level that Sir Adolphus Slade wrote after the suppression of the corps that, and I quote, "In the provinces, registration in an orta, that is a Janissary regiment, was general, so much so that Janissaries and the adult male Turkish population were nearly convertible terms," end of quote. And by Turkish, he means Muslims, of course. In the same spirit, Peysonnel, the French consul in Izmir in the late Izmir is Smyrna, in the late 18th century, maintained that, and I quote, "the Janissaries of the empire, that is, are in fact so numerous that if we could calculate their number, it would amount to several millions," end of quote. Of course, such statements sound extravagant, and there's no definite way to test their accuracy. Yet they clearly reflect a very real tendency, that of the increasing in the course of the 18th and early 19th centuries association of large parts of the empire's male Muslim population with the Janissary Corps. This is the phenomenon that we also witness in the case of Crete. At this point, I would like to note something important. According to what we often read in the existing bibliography, the involvement of Janissaries and their affiliates in the Ottoman economy should be perceived either as a result of an exogenous decline caused by the Corps' infiltration by all these Muslim populations, excuse me, or as a process set forth solely by the soldiers' private initiatives in the local market. But in my view, there can be a third approach. The opening of the Janissary Corps to the Cretan economy, as elsewhere, was based on institutional characteristics that existed for centuries and rested on the idea that the Ottoman military was a multifunctional establishment expected by the Ottoman central government to not only conduct warfare, which was, of course, its main remit, but also to play a crucial role in the empire's provincial administration, to maintain influential representative councils that counterbalanced the authority of other non-military administrative institutions, to produce its own revenues in order to finance a part of its peace and wartime operating expenses, to be the means of law enforcement in the provinces, the controller of markets, the collector of taxes, the fire brigade, and so on. So my point is that through their involvement in activities other than warfare, the Janissaries were not in fact disrupting the institutional framework that sanctioned them, but were merely flexing it in order to survive and to adapt to a new, more decentralized way of being and to a policy of low salaries imposed by the central Ottoman administration. The Janissaries, in other words, were equipped with the legal means to be a part of the empire's financial and political life. Their participation in it cannot and should not be treated as a declination from any true purpose, such as that of conducting warfare. Now, let's go back to Crete and see how this opening of the Janissary Corps to the local population affected the island's political life. Before its extended localization, which started in the 1730s, the Janissary Corps had little involvement in Cretan politics. Out of 5 cases of military revolts attested in the Ottoman sources of that period, only Two took place with the participation of Janissaries, and both of them were concerned with problems that had nothing to do with local politics, reflecting mainly internal issues of a professional army, such as problems connected to the corps' leadership and payments. From the 1730s until 1760, though, Ottoman and French sources make reference to 16 revolts in the island's three cities, explicitly mentioning the involvement of imperial janissaries in 12 of these cases. Of these revolts, three took place because of delays in the corps' payments, while the rest were pertinent to non-military financial and political issues, touching on greater problems of the local population who actively participated in the mobilizations. This can be easily explained. The numbers of Janissary pretenders had been increasing to such an extent that the province's salaried soldiers ended up constituting only a small fraction of the total Janissary population of Crete. And let me explain what you see in your screen right now. So basically, this is a comparison of the numbers of Janissaries given by European travelers and the actual numbers that we find in Janissary payrolls. All right, you can see the actual numbers in the purple color, and the green ones are the ones that outsider sources uh, actually use in traveler accounts and so on. So you can see this huge difference between the two numbers, and this difference has to do with the fact that the outsiders, the European travelers, cannot discern between Janissary pretenders and actual Janissaries. So they tend to add Janissary pretenders to these numbers. All right. So this is what was going on in the city of Candia. 25,000 Janissaries reported in the beginning of the 19th century in a city that had less than 40,000 population. All right. So there was another factor here, that the real Janissaries were progressively becoming disinterested in their military wages, which they saw as mere supplements to their income from their other financial activities in local markets. That is owing to the fact that their wages had been frozen from at least 1740 to 1826, despite the constantly decreasing silver content of the akçe, the Ottoman currency in which they were paid. And this is another factor that contributed to the reduction of the dependency of the regiments of Crete from the central Janissary administration. So not only did Janissary mobilization skyrocket during that time, but also acquired a completely different character than before, reflecting not the concerns of a professional army anymore, but also those of certain local interest groups and sometimes of larger parts of the Cretan Muslim populations. Because as I explained, now in these mobilizations, also the people that you see in these green bars here in this slide were also participating. And okay, so that made a huge difference in the type of demands that we could see that they were claiming, that the claims that they had in these during these revolts. Okay, so not only did Janissary mobilizations skyrocket during that time, but they also acquired a completely different character than before. So most of the mobilizations found in the sources are related to issues of taxation, of food prices, intercommunal and intra-janissary financial competition, while they often include organized or spontaneous acts of resistance against decisions of the centrally appointed non-military officials of Crete. This last aspect of the violent Janissary mobilization is crucial to our understanding of the evolution of Cretan politics towards the Ottoman central government in the 18th and early 19th centuries. As I already underlined, until 1826, the year of the abolition of the Janissary Corps, that brought about huge changes in the Ottoman perception of what the role of military institutions should be inside a modern state. The Ottoman army was a multifunctional establishment with powers and responsibilities that far exceeded those of a specialized modern army, constituting an integral and indispensable part of the Ottoman administration. In that fashion, the Janissaries, being in theory an Istanbul-based institution, were treated for centuries as the protectors of the central government's interests in the provinces, constituting not just a military force, but also an autonomous pillar of authority in the Ottoman frontier alongside the provincial governors, the local treasurers and judges, playing an institutional role in the administration of the Ottoman periphery. Needless to say, the preservation of their privileged status as imperial agents and the localization of their personnel on Crete made them extremely powerful. The authority of the local governors, treasurers, and judges that continued being appointed on the island for only a few years, on the other hand, proportionally decreased. These officials were called upon to rule a province dominated by armed and powerful local networks, without the cooperation of which almost no order could be executed. The more the number of people under the protection of the Janissaries, the less the governors could do to impose their will on the local population, and by the second half of the 18th century, the violent mobilizations against them became a frequent phenomenon. The years 1731 to 1812 witnessed 18 revolts against local governors, while only the years 1770 to 1812, a staggering 37 revolts and collective violent mobilizations directed against various groups were to take place. As I will explain, these groups also included the local and foreign Christians on the island. And at this point, I should note that in around 10 minutes or so, I will finish this presentation. So if you have any questions or comments, you're welcome to write them in the chat. Now, let's return to the question of Janissary political activity and its religious dimension. Two incidents were of particular importance for the increase of Janissary uprisings against the various Christian groups of Crete. The first was the local Orthodox uprising of 1770, which came to be known in Greek historiography as the Daskalogiannis Revolution, Επανάσταση του Daskalogianni, a byproduct of the Russian-instigated Orlov revolt in the Peloponnese, which took place within the framework of the Russian-Ottoman War of 1768 and 1774. The second incident that led to an increasing hostility of Janissaries against the island's Christian population was Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. These two incidents demonstrate the way in which the Janissary Corps' financial influence was analogous to and interdependent with its political influence. Through a series of Janissary revolts that followed the Christian uprising of 1770, a handful of Janissary entrepreneurs managed to take hold of the island's entire flourishing soap industry, which previously belonged almost exclusively to the local Orthodox Christians. Similarly, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798 gave the opportunity to the Cretan Janissary networks to take over a large part of the French merchants' lucrative commerce on the island, and to control the interest loan market, another privileged domain of the French up to that point. As a result, the loans given by Janissary regimental common funds to local businessmen, many of whom were old clients of French creditors, skyrocketed in the beginning of the 19th century. Another development which facilitated these processes after the 1770s was the rise in Ottoman politics in Istanbul of the Cretan Yusuf Ağa, who held the office of the Chamberlain of the Sultan's mother, Valide Ketşudası was his title, and who in the course of his career managed to become one of the richest and most influential individuals in the empire. Yusuf had established a solid network of relations with Crete, where he and his relatives owned vast properties and very lucrative tax farming contracts. He was one of the most important investors in the oil and soap industry of the island and a close collaborator of the local Janissary elite. Being virtually part of the imperial household and very close to Sultan Selim III, he often used his position in order to depose and punish those officials who acted against the interests of his affiliates. His presence in the central government, thus, acted as a guarantee for the smooth continuation of the financial and political activities of the Cretan Janissary networks, and for the impunity of their clients. Yet, all of this was about to change at the beginning of the 19th century. In 1807, Selim III was dethroned and his Cretan favorite, Yusuf was executed, while Sultan Mahmud II's ascension to the throne in 1808 gave a new dynamic to Ottoman politics. Mahmud, who was a supporter of the creation of a centralizing, authoritarian Ottoman polity that left little space for centrifugal powers to evolve, quickly realized that the various provincial power brokers, whether it be Yannis or Janissaries, would stand in his way. In his effort to rid himself of any political opposition in the provinces, he decided to use as a weapon a team of devoted imperial agents that were to be sent to various provinces with orders to violently interfere into local politics. In Crete, the governor that was called upon to initiate this process in 1812 was Hacı Osman Pasha, or as the Cretans called him, Opnigaris, the Strangler, who was in turn followed by other disciplinarian governors, all acting in an extremely violent fashion and always under the direct supervision and support of the Sultan, who in his tens of imperial edicts openly prompted them to show no mercy to anyone that resisted their authority, no matter what his social status or military rank was, and no matter if he was protected by the Janissary status of impunity or not. The period from 1812 to 1821 then became a time of unprecedented clashes between the Ottoman governors and the Janissaries. The interesting thing is that after 1812, there was an obvious change in the Janissary mobilization's intensity and scope. The lightning-fast purges that Mahmud II orchestrated on Crete against the Janissaries spurred their networks into collective action and channeled the much more haphazard violence of the period before 1812 into a consistent fight for a common political purpose. Throughout this process, the Janissary networks undoubtedly lost part of their previous power, but at the same time became much more united and self-aware, claiming for the first time the right to be recognized as the official representatives of the local Muslim population. This center-periphery conflict was violently interrupted by the 1821 Greek National Revolution, which would signify the beginning of the end for the core. On the battlefield, it quickly became obvious that the gradual transformation of the Cretan Janissaries into financial and political actors had taken its toll on their military performance. In 1822, thousands of Egyptian and non-Cretan Ottoman troops landed on the island in order to support the besieged Cretan military forces. In the presence of this tremendous force and being under constant attack by the local Christians, the Janissary networks realized that they could not continue pursuing their goal of political domination over the centrally appointed Ottoman officials anymore. Their fight became one of survival, and when in 1826 the suppression of the core was officially promulgated, no one dared to react. Through the sources of the period in question, it becomes obvious that the main objective behind the core's abolition was not that much the improvement of the poor military performance of the army of Crete, as it was to tear apart its multifunctional character and to subject its non-military functions to institutions that would be much easier to control by a central government. For instance, unlike what happened with the military-oriented aspects of the reform, to which the Ottoman sources devote no more than a few lines, dozens of documents refer to the confiscation of the Janissary Corps' common funds. Unfortunately, only the confiscation record of the property of the imperial regiments of Candia is extant today. Yet even from this document alone, it is easy to understand the tremendous economic power that the Janissary regiments had acquired in Crete. In the barracks of only 5 of them, without taking into account their real estate property, and with the money in cash of one of the regiments having mysteriously disappeared, the source lists a property of approximately 1 million kurush. This is a huge amount of money. And this is only a snapshot of what was going on in 1826. 2/3 of this sum were recorded as debts of hundreds of individuals to the Janissaries in the form of interest loans. The vast properties of the island's regiments were confiscated, stopping the flow of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of kurush to thousands of local entrepreneurs and giving a terrible blow to the Cretan economy. At the same time, the salaried Janissaries were forcibly enrolled to the Asakiri Mansure, that is the new military corps that replaced the Janissaries, but were now deprived of their former privileges and subjected to the strict supervision of the local governors. Their institutionalized role in the local administration was completely abolished, and their thousands of groupies were dispersed, posing no threat whatsoever to the political control of the center or to the radical reforms that were going to be imposed on them by the Egyptian and Ottoman administrations in the following decades. Now, as I reach the end of this presentation, let me conclude by underlining that the economic and political role of the Janissaries is yet to be studied in its collective and imperial dimensions. Most studies that treat the core as a coherent socio-political entity usually build their analysis on the case of Istanbul and pay little, if any, attention to its provincial structures. At the same time, the relatively few case studies which deal with the political and economic activities of the core's provincial units tend to downplay the latter's contact with the rest of the Janissary organization and do not evaluate their role as interacting parts of a large corporate imperial apparatus. Additionally, the Janissary's non-military activities have never been examined in their institutional framework, and are usually treated as either a symptom of decline from their true purpose, that of conducting warfare, or as the byproduct of individual soldiers' private initiatives. It is true that it is difficult to study the Janissaries after the 17th century, as the Janissary Corps was not a monolithic entity, and to make things even more complicated, during the 18th century, its own administration became increasingly decentralized. As the official Janissary payrolls demonstrate, in the second half of the 18th century, out of the 196 imperial Janissary regiments, only 43 were stationed in Istanbul, the rest 153 being dispersed in various provinces. This long process of decentralization meant that through time, in different areas, the Janissary developed very distinct characteristics from one another. It is true that their units were often in contact with each other and that they had a common central administration, rules, and privileges, which obviously created overlapping frames of reference amongst them. But the firmness of such bonds can be easily questioned, and no matter how tempting a generalization may be, we have to admit that these aspects do not always suffice for the creation of a common way of thinking and acting. Now, that being said, we have plenty of evidence that this decentralization did not bring about a rupture with the imperial politics, with the imperial political and economic scene. Instead, Janissary political and economic activities on the Ottoman periphery could be influenced by developments in Istanbul and transmitted from one provincial city to another. Thus, it is my view that we should start to examine the Janissary establishment as an organic whole in its diversity and stop putting that much effort in understanding what was going on in Istanbul, at least after the 1700s. Now, I hope that today's presentation demonstrated that the case of Crete is an example showcasing the need for such an interpretation, and that the amount of information one can get for the Ottoman economic and political early modern state of affairs just by looking into the functions of this very interesting institution is really enormous. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Yanni, for such an absolutely sort of fascinating sort of presentation. And I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions from our audience. But let me kickstart off the discussion. This example of the localization of the Janissary Corps, do we see that occurring in other parts of what's today modern Greece, but then it was the Ottoman Empire, like in the Peloponnese or Thessaly? Are there any other examples of, let's say, former Greek lands where this localization also occurs? Outside.
Excuse me. Okay, so yes, this was taking place all around the Ottoman Empire. It's not a Cretan phenomenon per se, but the truth is that in Crete, it was much more massive, and that had to do with the frontier status attributed to the island by the Ottoman administration, which meant that more Janissary forces were appointed there, and which also meant that like this forces, these regiments that were based there could create bigger networks. In the Peloponnese, you had there were Janissary forces, but not as many. So we don't see this type of development, at least not to this extent.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it was more pronounced in Crete. But what about
yeah,
somewhere like Cyprus? That would have been frontier territory as well. Do you see that phenomenon?
yes, Cyprus was not frontier territory, but
Okay.
also I have to. It was considered more like a peninsula of, like Asia Minor. So
Okay.
uh, they wouldn't see that as a frontier. It was well protected in their eyes. But what I also wanted to add to this is that it had to do with the time of the conquest of each region. Crete came under Ottoman rule in a quite late period. So in the 17th century, so when the war for Crete was taking place, it was exactly then that the Janissary networks started becoming more like a popular institution. The fact that you had a combination of war, which meant that the Ottoman administration needed more soldiers, and this opening of the Janissary court to the Muslims, to the empire's Muslims, created a very unique circumstance that gave the opportunity to local Cretans to get into the court, to be
Okay.
recruited.
A stimulus effect. And I think you mentioned when a Cretan was Islamicized, converted and joined the Janissary Corps, often they moved location because it would have been a bit complex or sensitive to stay in the same place. Did they also change their name, or they still retained their Aki surname when they did that?
They First of all, there were no surnames back then, right? It was like Mehmet, the son of Mahmud. Like everybody was registered as this, like this, but of course, you had nicknames that were turned into surnames later on. So they would keep their surnames, but they would change their first name, of course.
Okay.
Well, being a convert means that you have to get a Muslim name, but the truth is that they didn't change much apart from that. For that, so basically, they would continue to drink, raki and like all these alcoholic beverages, which are like it's something that is prohibited by Islamic law. They would only speak Greek, right? So, and they would maintain their Cretan culture. They would consider themselves first and foremost Cretans.
And
The
maintain the
Cretans,
vendettas, is that correct?
what they maintained?
Maintain the vendettas.
Yes, of course. Definitely. And this is one of the reasons why Janissaries were so ferocious in Crete, because of this Cretan culture of blood feuds.
Okay. I've got a question here from Emmanuel Dinis. Can you please talk through how the Christian population's relationship changed with the Janissaries over time?
This is a very good question. Thank you very much. In the beginning, they were the two communities were like communicating vessels, right? Because one would convert to Islam, but would still have relatives, Christian relatives. So they were in cooperation with each other. But like when the second, third generation of Cretan Muslims was came into existence, what happened was that uh, there started a rupture between the bonds of the two communities. And in the beginning of the 18th century, we see that there's still some level of collaboration. For instance, we see Janissary uprisings taking place in which Christians participate as well. But the more power the Janissaries acquired, the that was actually, to the detriment of the power of the Christian community, and that inevitably led to a clash between the two. So there was a gradual rupture in the relationship, which culminated in the 1770s with the revolution of Yannis. From that point on, the position of Christians on the island worsened. It became much worse.
Okay, got a question here from Mary Rakas. Thank you, Yannis. Could you please comment on marriage where Christian women Islamized? Were they encouraged for families for basically to seek a better life in that respect?
Yes, yes, definitely. They were. We have many cases of women, Christian women, converting to Islam. It was a very common phenomenon. As I said, half of the population became Muslims. In the beginning of the 19th century, that was a reality. And although for Christian women, it was not as important as for men, because a Muslim man could marry a Christian woman. All right, so if, for instance, like a Christian woman wanted to marry somebody who was coming from the other community, a religious community, she didn't have to convert to Islam. But men, Christian men were not allowed to marry Muslim women, which meant that if they wanted to marry a Christian, they had to a Muslim, they had to convert to Islam. So I think that more men overall than women converted on the island, although there are many cases for both genders.
Yeah. Another question: is the high proportion of conversions linked to the growth and complexity of the Janissary system in Crete? Is that what drove the conversions?
Yes, yes, 100%. As I said, it was like the Janissary core guaranteed protection and privileges that you could not get anywhere else. So yes, they would definitely do that for these reasons.
A question from Dave Watson: Janissary revolts were not unusual. Belgrade springs to mind. Were there any factors that made this more common in Crete? And like Belgrade, did the locals ally with other Ottoman players against them?
Mhm. Well, in the case of Crete, no, they did not ally with any other Ottoman players against the Janissaries, because they were there weren't there was no some kind of intra-Muslim controversy that would help such a thing to take place. Only in the beginning of the 19th century, in 1812, as I said, we have the case of these disciplinarian governors that were sent by Sultan Mahmud II, and who seem to have had some collaboration with Christians. There's one reference in particular that comes to my mind right now, which, according to which Osman Pasha, that governor, the disciplinarian governor, allowed Christians to bear arms. But this is a very unique and occasion. I don't think that in general we had other such occurrences. Belgrade's politics were much more complicated, and this is why you had this coalition between Christians and Muslim governors. But it was again the same framework, like Mahmud II wanted to get rid of local elites, and Janissaries were these elites.
Just another question for me. Is the impact of the Janissary of Crete on Greek subjects of the Ottoman Empire sort of overplayed a bit? Like, for example, if you look in the early years when the Janissary calls commenced, there were once Greek boys were being sort of taken away. I've read there have been protests by the Patriarchate, and then it was sort of redirected to more other Christian boys in the Balkans, and there was a reduction in Greek boys taken. Is there sort of any truth to that? I mean, do we have any sort of statistics in those early years? I mean, where were those boys from? What parts of the Ottoman Empire?
We don't have statistics. We have some registers that record this, the names and numbers of children taken in the areas, but because we don't have like all the series of these registers, we are not in the position of like judging what kind of fluctuations there were and to create an accurate statistic. But what I have to say is that you're right. Greek Orthodox subjects were not the most important group that contributed to this Devshirme levy. Like Slavic people, I think, were more important, and also a lot of villages in Anatolia, in Asia Minor, were contributing. That being said, I don't want to, downplay how many cases of so how many cases of such children we have in the sources. But overall, I have to say that in most people's mind, they believe that the Devshirme, the Pedomazoma, just continued until the 19th century. But this is not the case. It had basically became obsolete by the 17th century. So, and one reason for that was that also Muslims wanted their kids to enter this system. They felt that they have a disadvantage against Christians. Why should they take? Why should an Islamic State take the kids of the Christians for its administration and not our kids? That was the mentality.
Okay. Have a question from Elias. What did the conversions mean to the relationships of people and clans in Crete at the start of the 1821 revolution?
Yeah, by that time, as I said, there was like a big rupture already. So if you would decide to convert to Islam, that would meant that you wouldn't have any relation with you wouldn't maintain any relation with the Orthodox community. Because there was a lot of tension leading to the 1821 revolution. But in times of peace, in times of less tension, I would say that people would just continue carry on with their lives normally, and they would have to interact with one another. But generally, yes, by the end of the 18th century, early 19th century, becoming a Muslim was sounded like a very bad thing for the Orthodox community.
Things became much more polarized in that society.
Yes, much more polarized, definitely.
Yeah. Question from Theo. When the Janissaries were disbanded in Constantinople, what happened to the Janissaries in Crete? Yes, they were disbanded centrally, but what happened to the Cretan Janissaries? Well, they had dissipated mainly by then.
Well, the Ottoman government decided to not to kill or pursue the Janissaries in the way they did in Istanbul. what they did is, because basically everyone was connected to the Janissaries, and if they would do that, that would mean that they would weaken the power of Muslims on the island. So they decided to follow a carrot and stick approach, in the sense that the carrot was that they proposed the Janissaries to uh, to basically join the new core that was created in order to replace the Janissary core. But if they did so, they would have to uh, they would not have any of the privileges that they used to have when they were Janissaries. Also, what they did was that they managed to see who has a payroll and who was registered in the payroll and who was not. So they managed to kick out the Janissary pretenders, who were the actual power behind the most important force behind the development of Janissary networks.
Okay, just might finish off with one last question, and
Yes.
I know this question goes beyond the time period that you've researched. In 1912, Crete becomes independence. In 1923, we have the 22, 23, we have the Asia Minor catastrophe. So after 1912, what happens to the Cretan Muslim population? Yes, some depart, but do you see any reconversion back to Christianity? What are the trends until 1922, 23 on the
Well,
island?
although I'm not an expert on this, we have some conversions back to Christianity, but the vast majority of Cretan Muslims, started left for the island for Anatolia. They went to Anatolia, and especially with the exchange of population, like most of them went either to places like Smyrna, Izmir, or in Syria. Some people went to North Africa. Uh, yeah, so we have some cases of Muslim people who managed to stay on the island, but they had, British passports, or so they were considered to be foreign citizens, so that's how they did it.
Okay. Okay, I think we might bring proceedings to a close. Thank you very much for a very sort of fascinating presentation, Yanni, and hopefully we might have you back sometime in the future as well.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks once again, and we hope to see you all next week on the seminar by Eva Akhladi on Karamalidika literature. Bye, everyone. Good night.